The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay here on KSQD. I'm your host, Len B.A., and I am pleased and honored to have as my guest Jojo Mehta. Jojo Mehta is the co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International. Jojo Mehta co-founded Stop Ecocide along barrister and legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins, to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. As co-founder, executive director, and key spokesperson of Stop Ecocide International, Jojo has overseen the remarkable growth of the movement while coordinating between legal developments, diplomatic traction, and public narrative. Stop Ecocide International leads a global coalition of national campaigns, businesses, NGOs, lawyers, politicians, and indigenous groups who are working to criminalize ecocide at regional, national, and institutional legislatures. Jojo Mehta, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you.
First, it's a big topic, I know, but I wondered if you could start by giving us an example or two of ecocide in the world.
Yeah, so ecocide is now kind of broadly understood to refer to mass damage and destruction of nature. It's not intended to refer to every single small bit of damage that happens to the environment, of which, of course, there are a tragic number, but to identify the worst harms. So one might think of things like mass deforestation. One might think of the kinds of pollution that can arise in the extractive processes of the oil industry. Cases like, for example, the Chevron case in Ecuador that involved a lot of oil pollution of forest and rivers. You could think of, for example, when a whole river system is polluted by, mining activities, for example. Those are just a few things that come to the top of my mind. Of course, when you ask a lawyer, they will say, it will depend exactly on what text we end up with at the International Criminal Court and what each given case will present. But of course, we need to have some kind of idea of the scope of what this could cover.
Right. And of course, we now face dual global environmental threats from the effects of global heating and from the mass extinction of species. How does criminalizing ecocide specifically contribute to addressing either of those crises?
It actually addresses both in quite a major way. What we see at the moment around the world is this kind of rising frustration at the slow pace of action on climate and ecological breakdown and crisis. There's a lot of fine words coming out of governments. There's a lot of fine words coming out of these international conferences. And of course, there are some remarkable multilateral environmental agreements, like Paris Agreement, like the Global Biodiversity Framework that came out of Montreal. And of course, if everybody kept to every aspect of those agreements, we could be seeing quite significant change. But of course, in all of these kind of, if you like, soft law contexts, what we're seeing is a kind of varying degrees of non-binding and voluntary. And that is clearly inadequate to deal with the level of crisis that we're seeing internationally. Criminal law is very important in this context, and often people think of crime as the stick to punish people with. Effectively, yes, of course, that's how it functions, but it's not what it's for. What it's for is to protect us. Murder isn't a crime to punish murder as much as that's how it works. Murder is a crime to stop people killing each other. And criminal law has that kind of, outer boundary, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, genuine level of deterrence that, lesser or perhaps, less individual responsibility sort of forms of law, because of course with criminal law you're actually looking potentially at holding individuals responsible for decisions that they make, and that gets past that kind of corporate veil, if you like, where big multinationals might continue with business as usual, just knowing that they might have to pay a fine here or there or compensate a community. But once you have a criminal law in place that says, severe and either widespread or long-term harm to nature in and of itself is criminal, then you're going to start seeing a very different approach to due diligence, or, to what a CEO or a board of directors might sign off on.
Right. So in that sense, as a deterrence to crime, it's really important, maybe even before this becomes law, right? I mean, if they knew it was going to become law, could that have an effect?
I believe it already is beginning to have an effect, actually. And you've really hit one of the key kind of nails on the head, if you like, of why we advocate what we do and why we're so keen for this conversation to reach as many different networks and as many sectors in society as possible. Because it's one thing, obviously, to have the law in place, and politicians and lawyers often focus on what will that be like, who might that prosecute, how might that proceed, and of course that's all important. But actually, it's often, interestingly, the corporate sector and the business world that pick up more readily on the fact that it's actually the effect of it comes in when you hear about it, because actually it's not a retroactive law. I mean, law, generally speaking, isn't retroactive. It's not like, once this comes into place, you can go back over the last sort of, 20, 50 years and work out who might have committed ecocide in the past. That's not the point. The point is protecting the planet. So the point is that when people can see it coming, and I think that's the point you were making with your question, is that when people can see that this law is coming into place, they will have an attitude of, looking at, what that definition might be and thinking, well, how will that actually affect my sector? What are the decisions that I need to make differently if I'm going to comply with this approaching law? And that's really important. And I think where that sort of, where the rubber hits the road, to use a rather fossil fuel metaphor, or rather an automobile metaphor, and I'm sure there are better ones, but, is when people realize that this direction of travel is already in motion. And when I say, for example, that, 4 years ago, no governments were talking about this, and only a few jurisdictions in the world had something that might address this, we're now looking at a situation where, for example, the European Union is in discussions right now between the Parliament, the Commission and the Council about including ecocide level crimes into EU law. Now, that's a very fast trajectory for international law, and it's not stopping anytime soon. So this is an established direction of travel that people need to be aware of. And it's one that's, beyond necessary when we look at how fast we've been putting in danger, our ecosystems and ultimately ourselves.
Right. And you mentioned, progress in EU countries. We have kind of a political record here in the United States of having legislation kind of cave in to corporate interests, particularly really large corporations like fossil fuel industry, where we've had proposals, for example, of a carbon tax going all the way back to the mid-1990s that was completely destroyed by fossil fuel lobbying. And many, there's multitude of examples I could go into, but how much interference are you seeing or expecting in terms of trying to get the issue of ecocide introduced into the law books?
That's a really good question. And it's often, and journalists do often ask this, where is the resistance? Where are the obstacles that you're encountering? And I think what's interesting about this in the context of ecocide is it's actually very hard to argue with. I mean, I've yet to actually meet someone in person or in a direct conversation who says, no, massive destruction of the environment should not be a crime. I mean, it's kind of an intuitive no-brainer on one level. That doesn't mean, of course, that there won't be, companies and potentially, politicians resisting it, but they're not going to do it publicly. And that might not have been the case a few years ago, but I think now it really is. And we predicted that we'd be at this point, and I think we have reached this point now, where no government is going to want to be seen or heard directly opposing this, because they will just look terrible. So what we do sometimes come across as, a bit of sidestepping, delaying. Is this the right time? Is this the right approach? But nobody's outright saying this is a bad idea. And of course, when you move across to the corporate side of things, that's even more the case. I mean, particularly with these big multinationals that have spent 20 to 30 years effectively what's now known as greenwashing, they're hardly going to come out in public and say, well, no, we don't think this should be a crime, because that's literally going to wipe out all the millions of investment that they've put into making themselves try to look ecologically sound. And it's actually very difficult to greenwash with criminal law. I mean, effectively, if they come out and say, yes, we support this, they're effectively saying, yes, we agree to be bound by this. And so those who are really resisting this are not doing it publicly. They'll be doing, they're keeping very quiet, and potentially they may be having conversations behind closed doors. We don't know. But what's interesting is to see that actually there is, I think, a dawning realization almost across the board that what we're facing as a civilization, this is not just about individual communities with particular ecosystems they want to protect. We're actually now looking at survival issues for the human species. We're looking at civilizational collapse if we don't address these things in a really muscular way. And so there is that, that is starting to now seep through into so many different areas. And one of the one I would just point out as an example is the International Corporate Governance Network. Now, that is a global network of hundreds of the biggest asset managers on the planet, big banks, big pensions, big insurance companies. And it's all about, good governance in that context. Now, that network submitted statements to the climate talks, to COP27 in Egypt and previously to COP26 in Scotland. And those statements on both occasions actually urged governments to collaborate internationally to criminalise ecocide. And I think that is hugely significant, but because it shows that those who are moving around those huge amounts of money and backing projects are actually, in their approach to how to address the climate and ecological crisis, they're actually saying they want the stability of having these rules in place. And I think that's partly an investment issue, a risk management issue, but it's also partly showing that there is this, sort of dawning understanding that we actually need to concretely respond to this crisis. It cannot just be about targets and goals.
Right, and having a disincentive like that, like you could actually be penalized criminally for participating in a particular project or program. It seems like it could be extremely effective. Now, your organization is working at many levels. You're working at regional, national, as well as international, but one of your explicit goals is to try and get this to be recognized at the International Criminal Court as a crime.
That's
for
correct.
Ecocide to be a crime. And I wonder if you could give us a little history and background of the International Criminal Court, like how it was created and what powers it has.
Absolutely. The International Criminal Court came into being in 2002 following the signing of a treaty in 1998 called the Rome Statute. So the Rome Statute is the governing document of that court, and it lists the crimes that are considered the crimes of most serious concern to humanity as a whole, to the international community as a whole. And right now there are 4 crimes that court deals with, and that's genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression, which was added more recently. And so it's a court at the international level. It's based in The Hague in the Netherlands. And effectively, it can tackle cases that go right up to the level of heads of state. Now, in national jurisdictions, heads of state normally have a kind of diplomatic immunity, if you like, from criminal proceedings. That does not exist at the level of the ICC. So the International Criminal Court is kind of, you could say, it's the most powerful criminal court on the planet. And there are 123 members of that court, the sort of signatories and signed up members, if you like, to the Rome Statute. So it's not quite 2/3 of the world, but it's a significant number of countries. And it has a sort of structure that is similar to the UN in the sense that it's a one state, one vote context, which means that even, the smallest of Pacific Island states, for example, can lead this discussion just as easily as one of the major economies. And indeed, the Pacific Island state of Vanuatu, which is why I brought that up, is very much a leader in this space and a long-term partner with the sort of advocacy movement globally for this. And so effectively you can have, any state can propose an amendment, and it's purely a question of numbers as to it going through. You need at least 2/3 of member states to support in order for this to go through. But unlike the UN, it doesn't have a Security Council with a veto. So it really is as simple as, gaining that momentum internationally. And that's something that we're seeing to a greater and greater extent, in the sense that there are now dozens of governments on public record as having discussed this. I mean, obviously at various different levels of support. But there's a growing sort of group, if you like, of states that are willing to, enter into this discussion. And, not all of these are the most vulnerable, like Vanuatu, which is very much a champion. Some are also, for example, leading European states like Belgium, which is currently actually in the procedural stages of legislating for ecocide, or France, which has legislated already for ecocide, albeit with a different definition to the one that is mostly gaining traction internationally. So, yeah, I mean, I think that gives you a sort of broad picture. And perhaps as a little bit of historical background, I mean, ecocide is a relatively new concept. It was coined in 1970 and first introduced at the diplomatic level in 1972, so just over 50 years ago. But when the Rome Statute was being drafted in the 1990s by the International Law Commission, there was actually a clause there that would have covered severe, widespread and long-term harm to the environment that never made it into the final treaty at the time in 1998. And I always think if we just imagine for a moment, if 20 years ago in 2002, when the court opened its doors, if it had been able to cover that crime then what kind of world would we be living in now? It could be very, very different. And so from that perspective, what we can see and feel perhaps is that recognizing ecocide, mass damage of nature, as an international crime is actually almost replacing something that's missing that should have been there in the first place. And sometimes, we even get that response from the public, people saying, well, how comes this isn't already a crime?
Yeah, no kidding. And I'm really impressed by the breadth of this campaign that Stop Ecocide is conducting, because you're having to engage with governments and NGOs and international agencies of all kinds. And so I want to ask you more about that. First, for our listeners, I have here with me, if you're just tuning in, with me is Jojo Mehta. She is the co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International, and has been working on a international campaign to have ecocide become declared as a law, declared as a crime in the International Criminal Court. Jojo, I want to again, from the U.S. perspective here, the United States has a very inconsistent relationship with the ICC. We have, actively pushed for prosecution of some individuals, such as Slobodan Milosevic, who was convicted of war crimes. But we've also disregarded our own convictions, such as for mining the harbor of Managua in the 1980s. So how much impact do you think could adding ecocide to the list of international crimes have here in the United States?
I think that's an excellent question, because the US it has never actually ratified the Rome Statute, in fact. So it's not a sort of full member of the International Criminal Court. And I mean, sometimes this could be seen as a disadvantage. And actually, a couple of the other let's be honest, biggest polluters in the world, Russia, China, India, are also not members. And of course, sometimes we get the question, well, how in that case will it affect them? But I think there's a couple of things to think of here. And one is that the court itself has a broader reach than you might initially think from that, in the sense that, if a perpetrator from a non-member state is committing ecocide in a member state, then a prosecution can be taken. If somebody involved in that case is based in a member state, then a prosecution can be taken. And even potentially, if the operational office of a company that is engaging in those activities is based in a member state, then that could also potentially allow for a prosecution. I'll give one example of, in the case of the victims, for example, the Myanmar case at the International Criminal Court recently. Myanmar's not a member state, but the refugees, the Rohingya refugees, were based in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is a member state, and the court effectively, therefore, did have jurisdiction over that case. So there are various possibilities for reaching those countries. But the second thing that I would say, in fact, there are three things. The second thing I would say is it does mean the US doesn't have a vote at moving this forward, which may not be a bad thing. It also effectively, there's another issue, which is the issue that we are so globally interconnected now economically, that even if some of those biggest countries are not member states, if the rest of the world, and there's a kind of general, and like I said, there's already a direction of travel beginning to happen here, if the rest of the world is going in a certain direction, and those countries want to trade with the rest of the world, there is a sense of kind of entrainment, if you like, that happens in the wake of such legislation. And I think this also brings us to another point that's very important, which is that criminalizing ecocide, on one level, it feels like just adding a crime to a list of crimes, and it's quite a sort of simple and precise intervention. But on another level, it really has the potential to shift the culture at a sort of moral level. Because when you put the destruction of nature alongside the destruction of human beings, and you say this is actually just as bad, just as wrong, just as serious, what you're doing at quite a profound level is you're sort of shifting people's understanding of how important it is to pay attention to our relationship with nature and to actually take care of the ecosystems that fundamentally sustain us. And so what you're looking at is a kind of something that sort of shifts the consciousness. And I have to be honest, if we're to get through the next few decades and emerge with something that actually works in harmony with the planet, we're going to have that understanding. And so, there is a way in which that sort of nexus between the culture and the law, if you like, is kind of encapsulated at this point of recognizing severe harm as a crime.
Yeah, as an indigenous artist that I encountered recently put it very succinctly, it's not a choice. You have to learn to live in a way that is not going to destroy the very environment that provides for your food and water. So, it's not a choice. This is something that has to happen.
I think that's absolutely right. And indeed, we have a lot of interaction with indigenous spokespeople because there is such a sort of straightforward sort of affinity, if you like, between the approach of indigenous cultures and what this law is asking. I mean, there's something really in the kind of DNA of the indigenous approach, which basically says, if you damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. That is just a plain fact, and it's also, for them and perhaps ultimately for us too, it is a spiritual fact as well. And so having that reflected in the legal system feels like such a logical step that, it feels like a sort of natural affinity, and it's a really great way of highlighting why this is in a sense such an obvious step to take.
Yes. Now, if, as you said, the International Criminal Court now defines certain crimes against human beings only, it has not done any established any crime that's outside of the realm of human society. If in adding ecocide to that list of international crimes, would that change the direction or the makeup of the court? Would they have to, have people on staff they don't have now? Would they need to look at things in a different way?
Almost certainly it would involve some, additional training and so on. And I think that's not just a question of the International Criminal Court. I think that when we look at environmental law generally, and when we look at what environmental crimes currently exist, of which there are some, what we find is that actually it's becoming one of the most lucrative criminal areas is environmental crimes. And yet it's the extent to which time and resources are dedicated to investigation and prosecution is negligible in comparison to, say, drug trafficking, which is at a similar equivalent level in terms of how much the activity is engaged in. So yes, I think there will be not just the ICC, I think there will be a general increase and a kind of growth area, if you like, in reporting, investigating, prosecuting environmental harms. I'll make a very small correction to what you said, in the sense that there is one aspect of war crimes which does address environmental harm if it is disproportionate to the military advantage anticipated, and that comes under war crimes. As you can imagine, that's an extremely difficult clause to prosecute, and actually has never happened, although I think Ukraine would like to give it a crack with what's happened with the destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam last month. So it's not that there's absolutely nothing geared towards the environment, but the vast majority of the Rome Statute is geared towards human harm. Now, the definition that emerged from the independent expert panel that our foundation convened a couple of years ago was a huge milestone in this work, and it's triggered political conversations all around the world. And it actually rather miraculously fits on the back of a business card, or the core of it does. And that's actually super useful, especially when you're dealing with busy politicians who don't have time to read 20-page reports. But quite simply, it defines ecocide as unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And effectively, that's it's a very simple definition, but it kind of firstly, it's based on previous sort of treaties, which means that to a lawyer's ear it will have familiarity, but it's also very understandable to the layperson. And what I wanted to bring up in this particular context of your question is that it kind of makes a bridge between human harm and harm to the environment per se, because actually what it does allow for, and I think you're implying this, what it does allow for is for something to be a crime even if it doesn't actually affect humans. What I would also emphasize is that one of the reasons that this crime belongs amongst the most serious crimes of concern to the international community is that right now the damage may be influencing maybe having an effect on nature and not on humans, but you can bet that that's the precursor to actually human suffering as well. So we would say that it's actually kind of sort of bridges those things, and it starts to kind of shift law into a much better awareness of the responsibility to ecosystems and to nature per se.
That seems almost a given with any environmental damage. We're going to take a really short break. We'll be back with our conversation with Jojo Mehta, the co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International, right after this. Don't go away. Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. And if you're just joining us, I am here with Jojo Mehta. She is the co-founder and executive director for Stop Ecocide International, which has been overseeing a movement to create ecocide as an international crime. Jojo, you were discussing the impact of how having it as an international crime, how it even works for countries that aren't part of the agreement because so much of their activity is outside their own borders. And we've also seen a movement going on at the same time about recognizing the rights of nature. For example, in Ecuador and in many localities within countries, including in the United States. Where do you see this creation of ecocide, a recognition of ecocide as a crime and as a moral affront to life on Earth? as really moving us forward in achieving a more sustainable human presence on the planet.
I think that's interesting that you bring up rights of nature, because I feel like, ecocide law, the criminal law side, and the rights side, or the rights of nature side, are very much kind of two sides of a coin. They're kind of highly complementary. I mean, it's quite straightforward to understand this when you realize that, our basic human right, which is the right to life, is effectively protected by the criminal law of murder. In other words, the fact that it's a crime to take that life means that your right to life is actually protected. And so, you can imagine if murder wasn't a crime, the right to life might not quite have the same the same kind of standing or usefulness. And we see that the kind of rights in the criminal law sphere as being complementary in that way. And so in that sense, ecocide law relates strongly to the concept of the rights of nature, which, as you say, is now becoming evident in a number of jurisdictions around the world, although it'll be a while, I think, before the whole legal system shifts its focus in that direction. But it also is a kind of complement to the recently acknowledged human right to a clean, healthy and safe environment, which the UN acknowledged just last year. So there's a way that those legal developments actually mutually reinforce each other, in fact, which is, I think, really, really constructive and starts to move the whole conversation in a more conscious direction as far as our relationship with the planet goes. And it's kind of interesting because, you would think, obviously we all know that in order to continue these sort of extractive processes we've been doing, we are taking that from nature. It's kind of, on one level, it's blindingly obvious. And yet on another, we seem to be rather blind to the balance that is required in order to do that. And what we've ended up with, obviously, is a situation where a certain number of wealthy countries and a certain number of wealthy populations, relatively speaking, have ended up kind of treating nature, and indeed often other people, as a bank of resources in order to sort of feed a certain lifestyle and what have you. And that's something that, it's very tempting to point particular fingers at particular, companies or CEOs and say, you're the villain in this scenario. And obviously there are ways in which that is sort of true. But actually what we're looking at here is a far longer developing cultural phenomenon. Actually, those people making, those decisions are the logical product of a cultural attitude that has been in play for many hundreds of years and includes the whole colonial project and industrial revolution and all of this. But it also goes back even further, I would say. And I think it's interesting to look at the work of someone like Jeremy Lent in this context, who talks about the sort of patterning of Western culture and how the dualism that we live with between, humans and the planet, or you could say between sort of spirit and matter, or between, masculine and feminine, this sort of dualism runs right back in the Western canon. You can look at Plato and ideal versus the real. You can look at the Catholic Church and how spirit is opposed to body. You can segue straight into the Enlightenment, and you can have reason against emotion. All of these things have produced what we're in now. So when we talk about that kind of shift of consciousness that we believe ecocide law can help to sort of stimulate, if you like, or to galvanize, it's super important, because it's this kind of crossing point of this realization that the attitude that has brought us this far has brought certain numbers of people huge comforts and amazing results, but it's done it at a huge cost. And it's not sustainable. We cannot continue extracting from a finite planet. It's just not possible. So it's a kind of a wake-up call for that shift to happen, I think.
Yes, and it presents another quandary, really, that if we want to maintain the same level of consumption but just shift it to, so-called cleaner sources, it often involves, for example, massive electrification, for example, involves a huge increase in the amount of mining, which, besides the fact that mining is a very large contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, it's also many of the areas of high mineral availability are areas that are environmentally sensitive, and also in many cases, have been the traditional homes of people living there for, millennia, who could be displaced. So So there's a potential for, one ecological ruin to be replaced by another one. And how do we look at that in terms of changing our path?
I think that's a really absolutely essential thing to be considering, because we don't want to just do, as we say in England, jump from the frying pan into the fire. We want to actually take a different approach. And that's, for us, is a very much where ecocide law comes in. We're putting those criminal law parameters, those outer parameters in place that say, whatever you do next, it must not create a certain level of damage. Then at least we have a steer for how that innovation and how that direction has got to go. And of course, we all know the sort of necessity is the mother of invention. A lot of questions that we get around ecocide laws, well, how will we be able to do, X when Y is in place? And it's like, well, X is the thing we've always done. It doesn't mean that that's what we need to continue doing. Mm-hmm. And I also think it's a little bit disingenuous sometimes when people say, well, government and industry can't change that fast. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. I mean, let's look at what happened in the pandemic. Things can be changed very fast if the necessity is there. Mm-hmm. And of course, actually, we kind of know that the necessity is there, but because and perhaps until really relatively recently, for most people, it didn't feel immediate. Now, obviously, in California, you've got a rather more immediate situation, with wildfires, with all the, the kinds of effects that have been, the climate effects that have been being felt very acutely there, I think have probably helped to have these questions and the right kinds of innovations be much more part of the picture. But I think one of the things that an image that might help in this context is thinking about something like health and safety approaches. I mean, if you're building a new factory, you don't build it so that it regularly almost breaks people's heads open. You don't do that. You don't kind of go to the wire like that. But right. With environmental regulation, people do. They go, well, how much of this toxin can we use in this context before it crosses a line? They do try and take things right to the wire. Now, the difference with putting something like ecocide law in place is it's much more like that health and safety question. You're going to try and avoid completely that somebody breaks their head open. So you're going to actually, instead of constantly mitigating the risk, you're going to start avoiding the hazard. And that's what we need to do. We need to shift that mentality.
Yeah, it's like contrasting, as you say, we, in many countries, the U.S. included, we regulate how much of a toxin you can be exposed to. But there's also people doing work on alternative chemistry, trying to come up with substances that will do the same job without being toxic. And that's
absolutely,
that's a critical approach to how to resolve some of this. So in looking at ecocide as a potential international crime, it's kind of ironic. There are often laws used against peaceful protesters who are opposing environmental destruction, but those who are responsible for the environmental destruction itself are not prosecuted, or there's really maybe not even a law they can be prosecuted under. Could an international law against ecocide, or really any legal recognition against ecocide, shift that parameter in some way?
I think so, absolutely, yes. I mean, we're looking at a potential kind of 180-degree shift in the narrative. That's my feeling around this, because, at the moment, as you say, environmental and land defenders are often portrayed in the media as well as, disruptors of legitimate business activity. But as soon as you question that word legitimate and you put the question mark over the actual business activity, even if you don't take a case, even if you take a case and it doesn't succeed, even if, all of those things, just the fact that there is a law in place that means that could be investigated, and it might be the actual activity itself that is too damaging. At that point, you are completely flipping that narrative. You are basically, what happens is that those, those protesters or those defenders who have been seen as criminal are now the moral upholders of the law. And that is a really huge narrative shift. And it's really important, particularly in those countries where it is currently really quite dangerous to be an environmental land defender. As is the case in, Brazil and other South American countries, for example, but not only that.
Yeah, certainly in places like Nigeria and Kenya, we've seen, people outright murdered. Honduras, for taking a stand on environmental issues. And if we don't know that the governments were behind it, in many cases, there's plenty of evidence that they were, or the corporations that were involved in the activity. So, yeah, that could be a huge shift. How long has your campaign been in effect? How long has Stop Ecocide been going at this work?
So Stop Ecocide was, I co-founded Stop Ecocide with lawyer and legal pioneer, really, Polly Higgins, who's sadly no longer with us, in 2017. But we had already been working together for some years, and Polly herself had been advocating for this since around 2010. So the sort of advocacy began quite a while back, but the actual campaign, what is now an international NGO, I mean, we have associate groups in 45 countries now, I think, or maybe more. And that's happened in the last, say, 4 years or so. It's really, really moved very fast.
Yes. And one of the things you did was convene an international expert panel to kind of look at the legal issues and define a law for ecocide. And I wonder if you could talk about that experience of bringing those people together and working with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was an incredibly important milestone, as I mentioned earlier. And I read out the core of the definition. It's just the one sentence. And the experience was very interesting because, of course, in the past, there had been working definitions of ecocide, but they had mostly come from, an individual, whether an academic or a lawyer, or perhaps a small group, which is great, and it's important as part of the development of the concept and the legal approach. But of course, it remains one person's opinion or a small group's opinion. What happened in 2020 was we were approached by politicians, parliamentarians actually from Sweden, who asked us, who came to us and said, this is obviously your area of expertise. Would you be able to convene an international panel to come up with some kind of consensus definition with the level, with kind of a credibility and some, a sort of clarity that we could actually take to our government and say, could you propose this at the International Criminal Court? And on the basis of that request, we were able to draw together 12 top lawyers from around the world. And what was really interesting about that process was that not only was it a geographically diverse group from all continents, and also, it was gender diverse as well, but it was also ideologically diverse. And that's really interesting because, we had a former ICC judge, we had someone from the International Law Commission, quite sort of conventional approach, if you like, from those people. But at the other end of the spectrum, we had people like Pablo Fajardo, who worked on the Chevron case in Ecuador, or Valerie Cabanes, who's an academic lawyer from France, but also, very much more in the kind of people's lawyer or activist sphere. So there was a whole range of opinions as well as expertise. So we had international public lawyers, we had humanitarian lawyers, climate lawyers, environment lawyers. So with that mix, what that meant when the definition emerged at the end with all of their agreement was that it was a genuine consensus. And I should also say that it took into account quite a large public consultation that took place at the beginning as well. And all of those people had to concede something in order to arrive at that definition. And I believe that that's a large part of why it was received really quite well in the political world. And the media were obviously very interested in it too. And what we've had since then is a kind of a non-stop, kind of growing of interest, with more and more governments kind of joining the conversation and politicians engaging with it. So that's been really interesting and really exciting. I wasn't present at all of the discussions of the group, but the plenaries I was convening. So I witnessed the debates at that point, and that was fascinating. And some of the things, I'll give one example. The way that this crime is defined as it emerged from that group is it's based on consequences. In other words, it's not based on particular acts or particular behaviours. It's based on whether those acts will cause a certain level of damage. And that in itself was a big debate within the panel, because actually environmental law tends to list particular things like, you're not allowed to dump toxic waste in this context, et cetera, et cetera. But the overall, what the argument that won the arguments that won the day in the end took it in the direction it went, which I believe was the right one, actually. But it was fascinating to listen to, because one of the key things that was pointed out was that if you list behaviours, you're implicitly saying that anything that's not in the list is okay. And what that will do is potentially have those expensive lawyers in the multinational corporations trying to make sure that whatever they do doesn't fit that exact definition. Whereas if you come up with something that says whatever you do, it cannot create more than a certain level of damage, and then you identify what you mean by severe, for example, you've got a very different approach where it's actually, I'd like to think of it as empowering. You're actually giving people in those sectors the power to look at their own situation and be proactive about how they address it, so as not to create those, that impact. The other thing that does is it future-proofs the definition. And that's really important, because we don't know from one year to the next what kind of ecocidal nonsense someone is going to dream up to make money. So, if we haven't got the ability to list that exact activity, the fact that we can say whatever it is, it mustn't cause this level of damage, is actually a really, really important line to draw. And it's one that allows the definition to stay relevant over time. And the final point I would make is that it also encourages all of those people, and there are thousands, if not millions of people, working on improving certain particular areas of environmental regulation. Now, with the definition as it is, it kind of pulls those people forward. It means that whatever they do, it will improve this definition as well. Because when you say that, if somebody's doing something that's unlawful or wanton, it depends on the laws that are in existence. So the more laws and better laws are in existence, the more comprehensive that definition becomes. So again, it's that kind of way of pulling forward and moving forward into a different attitude or paradigm.
Right. Yeah, really, really talking about a cultural shift here. For our listeners who may just be tuning in, my guest is Jojo Mehta. She is Executive Director and co-founder of Stop Ecocide International, which has been working with a huge coalition of organizations and groups around the world to criminalize ecocide at the regional, national, and institutional level. You have been working, Jojo, with people in the International Criminal Court, with people in the EU, with people in the United Nations, and with a number of other organizations and national governments. And I just want to kind of get your personal take on that process and how that's been for you.
It's been an extraordinary experience, actually, because I think when we first started, we were kind of talking to whoever would listen, because that's all we could do. And then over time, as more and more people and different sectors and different interest groups and different governments have kind of joined that conversation, what we've actually realized is that, in a sense, that initial approach has become a concrete strategy, which is very collaborative. So, whenever we hold, we do a lot of things like webinars or conference events and these kinds of things, awareness raising sort of practices, if you like. And what we do is we always involve as many different organizations in those as possible, because what we've realized is that, politicians, who ultimately are the ones that are going to be taking this forward, government level or whatever, they don't like to be the first to the party. They want to feel safe. Right. They want to know that this conversation is a conversation that people are having, and that therefore they can weigh in on without being, sort of sticking their necks out.
Yeah, leadership is scary.
Yeah, exactly. So the kind of cross-feeding and cross-sectoral conversation is actually really, really important. So we've found ourselves kind of operating in these kind of two main areas. So the diplomatic/political sort of high level, if you like, which is the kind of core work of driving this forward. But at the same time, the much broader conversation in civil society, both in the private sector, but also in, academia, in law, in the, with indigenous cultures, with youth and faith groups, all of these things. And, what we're finding is that what we spend a lot of our time doing is connecting people and sort of addressing different kinds of audiences to kind of show how relevant this is to them. And the reality is, and it's it's such a kind of foundational piece that it actually is relevant to virtually everything. So, everyone who may have, people may have their particular, environmental campaign that's dear to their heart, whether that's save the koala bear or, don't pollute with plastic or, whatever it is. And, all of those will be supported by ecocide law being in place. It's like a kind of, fries with everything. It's kind of, right. It's got that kind of quality to it. So that's one of the things that's really emerged over time, and it's been very exciting to watch, actually, and to sort of see how those interactions develop. And sometimes you get people who just kind of had these light bulb moments. Like, oh my God, this is obviously the thing that needs to happen, and then you have plenty more who have, as I say, their own particular things that they focus on, but they're like, oh yeah, that would really help, actually.
Yeah. And you've studied language and culture, and you've reflected that some already. I understand also that your mother was a songwriter and poet. And I wondered if you could talk about how your background has informed your work and maybe even inspired you to move in this particular direction in your work.
Oh, thank you for that. I don't always get asked those sort of background personal questions, but it's really nice. No, you're right. My mother is a singer and a songwriter, Jojo Mehta. And her work has always been deeply, deeply inspired by the earth and the seasons. And so I guess having grown up with that, there was always a sort of deep thread of kind of care for nature, love of nature there. But I would say it started to sort of emerge more maybe in my 30s. I became what you might call an armchair activist, in the sense that, I'd be kind of, signing petitions or, sending off letters to my elected representative, that sort of thing, which is all very important to do. But it was actually, funnily enough, it was when I discovered fracking. And, most of your listeners may know what that is, but it's short for hydraulic fracturing. It's a rather very polluting way of bringing oil and gas out from deep in the earth. And when I discovered it, I remember having this conversation with friends and family, and my little daughter, who was 5 at the time, burst into tears and said, "Mummy, I don't understand. If they're poisoning the ground, they must know they're poisoning themselves. You have to call them and tell them to stop." And I just had this moment, I was thinking, it's so obvious to her. She's 5, she's 15 now, but, at the time. And I just thought it should be this obvious to everyone. And that kind of, if you like, kind of got me up out of my armchair, started writing leaflets, giving talks, organising demonstrations. And that's actually how I came into contact with Polly Higgins, with whom we ultimately started Stop Ecocide International. And she just had this very straightforward approach to how do we deal with this? We just make it a crime. And of course, at the time, that was still considered a bit sort of left field and extreme, but it felt so obvious that I ended up kind of full-time dedicated to it.
Yeah, and the more you learn about ecocidal activities, the more you realize it is incredibly deserving of being criminalized. So, personally, I thank you for the work you're doing. But for other people who'd also like to support your campaign, how can they help?
Well, first of all, of course, I would recommend going to our website, which is stopecocide.earth. It's very easy to find. And there's a kind of Act Now menu as long as my arm. And there's so many different things that one can do to get involved in terms of, it could be anything from, giving a talk, but it could also be, researching a certain thing. It could be, there are so many different ways. And we also have growing particular interest groups. So we've got, Ocean for Ecocide Law. We've got Farmers for Ecocide Law. We've got Youth for Ecocide Law. So there's these different groups, and whatever position you're coming from, there's likely to be something for you. But I would also come back to a very simple thing, which is talk about it. Because actually the word ecocide itself has its own kind of internal momentum. I mean, it literally means, from the Greek and Latin, to kill one's home, which seems like an extraordinarily apt way to describe what's actually happening on our planet. But it also has that kind of punch to it that genocide has, that homicide has, that suicide has. Ecocide, it's like it's destroying the environment. It has a clarity to it. And that we still have a situation where a lot of people simply haven't heard that word yet. So we would absolutely, whatever else you do, is talk about it in your networks. And we all have networks, big and small. And that all helps to to sort of move the dial forward.
Yeah, yeah, and and something like global warming could be just called an ecocidal process in itself. So we have lots of examples to point to. Well, we're just about out of time, but I want to ask you if there's anything else you'd like to share with our audience before we say goodbye.
I would actually, and that's that. Even though the US is not a member of the International Criminal Court, what you do have over there is an interesting legal structure where states can actually legislate for something, even if the federal government hasn't yet done so. And of course, California is one of the biggest economies in the world. And it's also one of the most progressive. And so what I would certainly encourage all of your listeners to be doing is talking about it in California and actually talking to your own elected representatives around approaching a law of ecocide and investigating that. I think that would be a really exciting thing to do.
Wonderful. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the program, Jojo Mehta, and thank you so much for the work you're doing. And just thank you. I really appreciate having you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.